and by extension the literature on caring, is somewhat, why do we put our flashlights there? Why do we focus on that? Well, partly it is that there are more women in economics raising these issues, mothers who are also economists and so forth. But I think it's more than just personal standpoint. I think it's also a change in what the economy does. So that leads me to briefly, because I decided not to focus on this, ask the question, what else needs to be questioned from the machine metaphor? What else might we think about because of the rise of the service sector, the feminization of labor? One that, and so I'm just taking liberty because this is my presidential address, I get to talk about whatever I want to bring up a pet peeve, which is the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, which has driven me nuts ever since I was an undergraduate. Basically, well, why is some labor unproductive? Well, only if you think about the economy as purely a system for transforming resources into physical, tangible outputs, then yeah, all this other stuff like taking care of people is simply unproductive labor. It doesn't create anything, it doesn't create value. Here I'm picking on the left. But instead, first of all, I just can't see dismissing that much of the contemporary economy as unproductive. I just don't find that useful. And I think you miss, in fact, important insights to be gained from the lived experience of economic life. I remember I jumped forward a slide and then I never went back. Oh well.
It was
We didn't notice.
the definition of
Social provisioning, I know, as a metaphor. Well, if I have time, I'll slide back. But we don't just produce education and medicine and those things. We have casinos. And as I said, a lot of this came from my thinking about the casino economy. And the quote in blue really relates to this idea of the casinos as a metaphor for the contemporary economy, in particular the idea of increased risk in the economy, that we live in a world in which buying a home, taking out a student loan, all of those things that used to seem like sensible things to do now feel like gambles. But it's also, as I said, an industry in which we produce experiences, but also identities. Part of what people are doing when they go to a casino, in talking to the employees over the last several years, last 8 or 9 years, about what they do in the casinos, what can people do when they go to a casino is they're kind of living out a fantasy. I'm James Bond for the day. I'm Wyatt Earp for the day. Or at least I'm pretending to be a high roller. And the casinos themselves, right? They create these fantasies. There's a Wild West casino. There's a Taj Mahal casino. There's a this casino. And they're created as fantasy worlds where people get to live out different kinds of identities. And the employees themselves have to perform identities to facilitate the experience. And this is where I put in an ad for the fact that I'm giving a paper with Deb Feigart on this in the next session if you care to go. Because I'm not going to be able to talk about the performance part as much today as I might like. So what does it mean if we're producing experiences and producing identities? That's something I want to be clear that economists have always done. It's not that I'm saying this is a completely new thing, but it has really become a core process rather than something that happened on the side. And I'm going to go back and talk about the transition of the Industrial Revolution and the production of identities in that. So I'm not saying it's new, but I do think it has become a core process. And this is, for example, illustrated in the work of Naomi Klein in her book No Logo, in which she talks about the ways in which companies have focused on branding. And that branding, essentially making things, is not what Apple does, which is why they don't care where they offshore it to or who does it. They don't care about making iPhones. They care about selling the idea of the iPhone. That's what it's about. It is about the image of Nike, not the sneakers. So it doesn't really matter who makes the sneakers. You can offshore that. You can have anybody make the sneakers. Because the core thing that businesses are doing right now is selling the ideas of their products, selling an identity. I am someone who wears Nikes. I'm going to date myself. Be like Michael Jordan, right? My students wouldn't know that, and then I'd have to explain it to them. But I think there's enough people in the room who remember those Nike ads. So they're basically, and so outsourcing, subcontracting become much more viable when it's not about making things, right? The precaritization of work, whether or not you have, the workforce becomes less important because the people that matter are the people developing the branding, right? The other people who make things don't matter anymore. And other structural changes. And Janice Peterson's presentation yesterday, she reminded me that a more updated version of some of this story can be found in the new book by David Weil on the fissured workplace, which also discusses the relationship of branding to the breakdown of work, the precaritization of work. And so basically what I'm arguing is that as this has been going on, economists have sought ways to incorporate identity into economic theory. And then what I'm going to do is talk about one way that I think I've tried to do it and think more people ought to do it. So first let me talk about what some other people do. And John, I'm just in love with you today, I guess. So the number of people have talked about identity in economics, and I'm really not going to do any of this, but just to highlight that in recent years it has become a topic. From Akerlof and Cranton in the QJE, and then the critique of Akerlof and Cranton done by Bill Darity and some of his co-authors, and John Davis's work. What I want to focus on is the ways in which we create and express meaning, and identities as a subset of meaning, right? Through our life activity, including our economic activity. So what we consume is partly to satisfy wants and needs or whatever, but what we consume is also partly, as this branding literature has pointed out, part of the way we express who we are, right? I am a person who looks important because I have a BlackBerry or whatever. Our jobs also are a way that we express our sense of identity, other kinds of economic activities. So in particular, what I want to focus on is this concept of social practices, and there are a lot of various versions of social practice theory descended from Bourdieu out there, Anthony Giddens and so forth. I'm particularly talking about feminist social practice theory today because my social economics and my feminist economics are very internested with each other. Social practices are defined by Raewyn Connell as patterns of behavior that express norms and beliefs, especially about collective identities such as gender, race, ethnicity, and class. So they're kind of akin to or a subset of institutions and habits. They focus on process rather than just inputs and outputs. And social practice theories focus then on the production of identities, often through bodily experiences, but not exclusively. What Evelyn Nakano Glenn and some other people have argued is that social practice theory, by emphasizing that these social practices evolve out of particular times and places, historical conditions, but because they are created by human beings and therefore can either reinforce the existing order of things, the existing identities, or can be used to transform them. They balance that structure with agency. They're a way of getting out of that dilemma of, is it structure? Is it just choice and agency? I did skip over my social provisioning slide earlier, where I talked about social provisioning within social economics as an alternative kind of metaphor. I mean, the word provision. Where do we get that from? We get the concept of provisioning from the idea of supplying food and other necessities to our families, to our loved ones, to the people we know. And so talking about social provisioning as an alternative definition of what an economy does is essentially a metaphor that takes a broad economic process that is not limited to market mechanisms and makes it stand as a metaphor for economic life. What in a recent book talk that I was giving, I was chatting with someone at the University of Massachusetts, a junior faculty, who was like, but when I talk about things like the household or the family, I get told that's not market, so it's not economics. And I'm like, how do you think people provided for themselves and their families for centuries? For centuries. The market mechanism is a relatively new institution for provisioning, right? It's only a small subset of how we take care of ourselves. We have always done subsistence farming, self-provisioning, worked with kinships and families and networks and households and communities in order to provide. And what's nice about thinking about social provisioning is it gives us a much broader definition of what economic life is, and then allows us to think about different kinds of institutional mechanisms for creating and recreating that economic life. So see, I got that slide in. So specifically, Bill Duggar, in redefining economics a number of years ago, 20 years ago now, I guess, talked about social provisioning as an alternative definition for what economics is and what economics does. And he argued that one of the important things about social provisioning is that we don't simply produce goods and services, we also produce people. And we have to keep in mind when we think about economies that that is what we're doing. We're not simply providing outputs. We create people through our economic lives. So what social practices focuses on the fact that we don't just create people, we create particular kinds of people, particular categories of people that have different sets of, I decided not to bring capabilities in here overtly, but it's kind of in there. And that's based on their social identity. And I argue that economics and economic life are replete with different kinds of social practices. I want patterns of behavior that produce identities. And I want to walk you through some of my favorite examples that I love to talk about with my students. My favorite is thinking about the notion of the breadwinner, the male breadwinner. The idea that to be a man is to take care of your family by going out and bringing home the bacon. That is a very particular notion of what masculinity is. And it certainly wasn't the one that Jane Austen was writing about in her novels, or I gather Downton Abbey came back last night and the motivating plot of Downton Abbey. Basically, the motivating plot of all of those stories is women can't inherit land. Why? Because land is what makes a gentleman. Land is what makes a gentleman, and gentleman is the hegemonic idea of masculinity in the period in which land is the most important economic resource. So therefore, men, particularly the highest order of men, are allowed access to land, and other marginalized groups are not allowed access to land, whether they're serfs or women or whatever. And I argue that while the enclosure story that Marx came up with is a lovely and important story, lots of sirens going off, is a lovely and important story about how we created a labor force to be available for industrial capitalism. It's not the whole story, and it's certainly not an American story. Land was abundant in the United States. So with the abundance of land, as settlers kept pushing the Native Americans off into smaller and smaller areas, how do you convince a man to work for someone else? Particularly in a context in which, I'm on the next slide already. Particularly in a context in which working for someone else was actually perceived of as slavery. So it was there's not only a gender component going on, there's a racial component going on in 19th century America about what it means to work for someone else. The concept of working for someone else was described as wage slavery, essentially akin to being a slave, associated with indentured servitude. Also, it's important to remember that the first wage laborers in most industrialization processes are girls, because they're expendable on the farms, right? They're just kind of helping mom in the kitchen, but they're not in doing what are seen as some of the key processes on the land, and so they're expendable. So again, a devaluation of what it means to actually go work in a factory, go work for someone else. So as we have this transition from textiles to other forms of manufacturing, how do you create a male working class? And that was done through human agency, the creation of a new social practice, which was the idea of the male breadwinner. And it was done by a lot of economic actors, from labor unions. Lawrence Glickman has written about this in a book called The Living Wage. I think that's what it's called. The ways in which essentially labor movements organized to create the definition that if you could have a living wage, you were no longer a wage slave, and therefore it was okay to go work for someone else. There's also a fabulous JEH article, Journal of Economic History article, by a guy named Wayne Luchuk, which is in a book that Deb and I have edited, a reader, talking about the creation of the male breadwinner identity at Ford Motor Company and the ways in which Henry Ford and people who worked for Ford, and how central to American industrial capitalism can you get than Ford, right? We call it Fordism. Talked about the creation of this male, what it meant to be a Ford man, right? It was a point of pride to wear your jacket and show that you were a Ford man because you could provide for your family. The kinds of newsletters and so forth and activities that they created to make men feel like they were a part of something that was valuable, important, because they made useful products and they supported their family. So a new definition of what it meant to be a man based on this idea of masculinity as being a provider. So as I said, wages are a key part of this, creating the idea of a living wage. And who gets different kinds of wages is something that was explored with my co-authors in the book, Living Wages, Equal Wages. Basically, wages are a social practice, we argue, as well as being a price and being some other things, because they express meaning and define your identity, and they define what you can or can't do. So some of the historical debates that people had in thinking about economic theories and identities, about who could earn what money, what amount of money. One question was, would the male breadwinner just be the prerogative of the middle class? But the working class would have additional workers, right? Originally going out into the working in the mines, as Jane Humphreys has studied, working in the factories together. Or would the working class get access? Would racial and ethnic minorities get access to a living wage so that there could be a male breadwinner supporting their family? Or as Marilyn has in particular written about, could women get paid enough that they could live independently? Well, no, not at first. And partly, part of the point of having a wage gap was that women should have to live with a male provider, whether it's their father or their husband. And this is, I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is a diagram from our book in which we talk about, it's not the only thing wages do. Wages also reflect supply and demand conditions. They also are related to the classical political economies that they are living, that therefore has to sustain the macroeconomy. But it is one of the things wages do. So I'm arguing that we need to begin to think about more the way in which our economic life is constituted by social practices. I think that it's a much more interesting way of talking about gender, race, and other social identities than the ways we often do it, which is to reduce them, as Deb mentioned, her dummy variable piece, then simply reducing them to variables. Because essentially, as in chatting with Deb about this, essentially regression methodology, right, is about independent variables that give you an output. It's a machine metaphor, right? Regression is this, not to say it's not a useful tool, because I'm not saying all the insights that we get from the machine age should be thrown out. We just need to know what they reveal and what they don't reveal. And so I'm not trashing regression methodology. Some of my best friends do regression. But we need to understand the concept, what the concept is, and what it shines light on and what it doesn't shine light on. And so another way that happens is in most discrimination theory, from Gary Becker, to segmentation theory on the left. Essentially, we assume that, well, somehow neutrally and in the idea of efficiency or profit maximization or whatever, control, businesses create jobs. And some of them are good jobs and some of them are bad jobs. And where does discrimination come in? Well, that's the allocation. Who gets which job? It's a question of distribution. And that's essentially what segmentation theory argued. What social practice theory and feminists have argued, as well as others, is that no, gender, race, ethnicity, and class actually shape the places, shape what the job looks like. You don't create a job that's part-time, where someone gets off from work by 3 o'clock, that has low wage and expects a lot of turnover, and then say, I'm gonna hire women for this. Instead, you think about, available labor force, what do I want? I don't really want a high turnover would be useful. I don't want to have to keep paying people a lot. Let's make this a feminized job where somebody can come home to their kids by 3 o'clock. Those things all happen together. They're not separate processes. And so employers construct jobs with an image of who will hold them. Wrong thing, sorry. If I click next there, it'll go away, right? All right, so summary and implications. What have I walked you through today? Basically, I'm arguing that our lived experiences of economic life shape the metaphors that we use to describe the economy. And these lived experiences are shaped by structural factors like modes of production, factory age, casino age, whatever. But they're also affected by our individual standpoints, our collective identities, based on our collective identities, our social identities. Those social identities themselves are social constructions that are defined by prevailing social practices. Those social practices are created by human agency, and they can either, at some times, simply transform the existing set of social relations and economic relations, but sometimes there are periods in history in which they are transformed through human agency. So social practices have periods of both rigidity and change. What do I want you all to do with this? Well, I think that to improve our theorizing, economists and other economic actors out there, because economics is performative, need to be attentive to what existing metaphors illuminate and what they obscure. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yeah, Lisa.
Just one thing, I just thank you very much, that was fabulous. I was thrilled to hear standpoint theory and economics presentation. Anyway, just one small thing about standpoint theory.
Yeah.
When you said land was abundant and free, at once the settlers got the Native Americans out of the way.
Yeah, right.
Looked around to see if there were any Native Americans visibly.
Sorry.
Succeeded here. I would encourage you to rethink.
Not joke about that.
And not joke about that, but I'll think more deeply about the cost of the land
Yeah,
to society.
that's true. Good point. I did treat that with a bit of frivolity. Yes?
Lotta Moberg from William Bear. I really appreciate your emphasis on think about economics with your metaphors, and you mentioned the economic system as a beating heart. I would have hoped that you would elaborate a little bit on that, and if you thought about that more on how you think about that.
Basically, since I stole it, I'm going to encourage you to read Julie Nelson's 2006 book, Economics for Humans, where she elaborates on the concept of economics as a beating heart. So.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.